Hello, I'm David Marler. I'm very honored to be part of this international lineup of speakers and researchers here for the 5th Symposium on Ufology and Exobiology. It's truly an honor. Many of the fellow speakers are friends and colleagues in the field of UFO research. Today's topic we will be focusing on will be my ongoing research in the area of triangular UFOs or UAPs. The title of the presentation, as you can see, is Triangular UFOs, New Historical Cases and Validated Insights. For those that are familiar with my work, for the last 20 years, in addition to UFO research in general, I focused on a particular subset of UFOs, namely these triangular UFOs, which over the last several decades have increased with frequency in the number of reports that we've received. And I felt duty-bound to start looking at the data and uncovering more information as I collected new historical data sets. I'm very happy to share the information that I've been working on over the last 2 years as part of a new collection, which I'll be discussing at the beginning of our presentation here. So, for those that are familiar with my research, I did publish a book in 2013, Triangular UFOs, An Estimate of the Situation. And again, based up until 2012, I had gathered a fairly large amount of data as it relates to triangular UFO reports, both here in the United States where I reside, but also internationally. And I'm very happy to say that on our presidential election day here in the United States on November 3rd of 2020, in addition to the heightened anxiety surrounding our presidential election, I was doubly anxious because I was awaiting this truck to pull into my driveway of my home. This truck housed the largest single collection of historical UFO case files that we have to date. And the information that was delivered on that particular day involved the case files for the Center for UFO Studies, or CUFOS, founded by Dr. J. Allen Hynek. It also contained the exhaustive files of the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, or NICAP, which was headed up by Donald Kehoe and Richard Hall. But in addition to that, in addition to these two well-known historical UFO research groups, it also contained the early research files from the early to mid-1950s from a group called CSI New York, not the TV show of the same name, but it stood for Civilian Saucer Intelligence of New York. And they were an early pioneer in cataloging UFO sightings and UFO information. And in addition to those case files, here in the research room where I'm sitting, where I do most of my work, I also have the original Project Blue Book case files of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, which have a lot of commentary and notations made on the various Blue Book cases that he investigated and consulted on. And so it was based on this wealth of information that I now have this unafforded access to, unfettered access to, that I decided to start looking at these case files, looking at the reports of triangles that may have existed in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Well, while I was going through the case files in 2021, we had the United States Pentagon UFO or UAP report, which really put the official seal of approval on the UFO subject. And no longer are we getting the tongue-in-cheek reporting and the ridicule. The skepticism is eroding on the part of the general public. The worldwide community is now looking at the subject much more seriously. But what's interesting is, despite many of the discussions and talking points that members of the government as well as the intelligence community have made regarding the subject, and most recently during our House hearings in Washington, D.C. On May 17th, the intelligence individuals that were representing the investigation into the subject didn't appear to have a working knowledge of UFO history. And this is not the first time that we've noticed this. And I find it interesting that we're looking at these military UFO or UAP reports in a very serious light, but they're only looking from the year 2004 until 2022 and moving forward. And I think that's a huge disservice to the UFO field and the UFO data, because this year, 2022 marks the 75th anniversary of the modern age of UFOs, or as I like to say, the modern awakening to the UFO phenomenon, because certainly we had reports prior to the famous Kenneth Arnold sighting on June 24th, 1947. But now more than ever, I think it's important to appreciate the history of the mystery, as my friend and fellow presenter Philip Mantle in the UK likes to call it. We have 7.5 years of civilian and military UFO reports spanning the globe. And I think it's naive to ignore all of that data and only look at 2004 moving forward. So I feel it's incumbent upon people like myself, historical researchers, who have access to a lot of case material to be able to present an accurate telling of history as it relates to the UFO subject. And there is no shortage of UFO case files, I can assure you. The collection that I received in 2020, there are literally thousands of UFO case files. Many of those, of course, are IFOs, identified flying objects. Many people report satellites or meteors or comets, weather balloons, the planet Venus. But despite all the IFOs, there are some highly intriguing cases and many that fall into the category of triangular UFOs, which we'll focus on. And when we talk about triangular UFOs, we tend to think that it's this uniform shape, when in fact, we're dealing with equilateral, we're dealing with elongated or isosceles triangles in some cases, we're dealing with pointed, rounded triangles, and many people like to put into that same category, and I will, in the course of our presentation today, focus on the V-shaped or boomerang-shaped or chevron-shaped UFOs that fall under that umbrella category of triangular UFOs. But there are a lot of false assumptions out there, and I see this play out on the internet and social media quite often. People think that all the UFOs, triangular UFOs, look the same, and they usually think of this imagery. And certainly, this is one of the more prevalent descriptions that we do receive in the modern era, as well as the historical cases. But in fact, the shapes of the triangles vary. They're not all equilateral. Again, some are isosceles. The size varies. The vast majority are very large, estimated 200 to 300 feet in length. However, there are smaller triangles that have also been reported in the historical literature. In addition, the color of the triangles, most people think that they're all black or all dark. In fact, many of the reports that I receive even today describe glowing triangles of varying different colors and hues. And also the lighting characteristics, the lighting configurations tend to vary on many of these reports. Again, based on the image that you see there, though, that is one of the more prevalent descriptions that we do receive. And another idea that is a false assumption is that the triangles are something relatively new to the UFO subject. And many people, both in the general public as well as UFO community, tend to reference these things not appearing until the last 20 or 30 years. And hopefully in my book, but also in my presentation today, we'll really poke holes in that entire argument and that belief. And then those that believe that these are all modern also tend to fall in line with another false assumption, that all triangular UFOs are military in origin, and they quite often will evoke the term TR-3B. And the TR-3B has become a pervasive urban myth, especially on the internet and social media. But we can easily trace the story back to one individual by the name of Edgar Fouché. Mr. Fouché stated that he back engineered triangles purportedly from recovered ET technology, and that we have developed these triangles that have exotic flight characteristics that were developed at Area 51 where he worked. Now, I don't necessarily question the man's credentials, but I do question the claim simply because we have absolutely no evidence other than one man's testimony stating this. Unfortunately, Mr. Fouché passed away in 2017, so we really can't ask him those hard-hitting questions and have a debate with him regarding the subject. And most people fall into two camps. Either you accept the TR-3B as a reality or you do not. I fall into the latter category given the absence of information or evidence to support it. But regardless, even if it was valid, how can this, the TR-3B, that was admittedly created in the 80s and 90s, if you believe the narrative, how does that explain triangles that pre-existed? How does that explain that? we cannot use the military explanation for these historical accounts. Adding to the confusion, as if the TR-3B wasn't bad enough, online many people have cited U.S. patents regarding triangular aerospace vehicle concepts. One that is extremely pervasive on the internet is this one that was filed by John St. Clair for a, quote, triangular spacecraft, unquote. It was filed in 2004, published in 2006, and the key word is published. But a friend of mine that worked at the patent office looked into this, and a patent was never issued for this particular concept. So this cannot be used as an explanation for man-made or military triangular UFOs. In addition, Salvatore Pais, a well-known aerospace engineer, did file a patent in 2016 for a, quote, craft using an inertial mass reduction device, unquote. It was in fact issued, a patent was issued for this in 2018. But again, that's relatively late in the game when we look at these triangular UFOs and the history of these things being reported for decades. So I don't think that we can use that as an explanation for triangular UFO reports. And then some common sense arguments have to come into play for the military explanation. Reports of triangular UFOs preceded these patents prior to 2004 and 2016, respectively. And another important point we have to consider, a patent is not evidence of a working model or a prototype. It's simply a proof of concept. One does not have to have a prototype or working model to obtain a patent. You can file detailed diagrams, schematics, blueprints that has to show, based on scientific principles, that it is a feasible working model if developed. And that is the case with the Salvatore Pais patent. And so we really can't look to these for explanations for these triangular UFO reports. But during COVID, while I was doing this historical research, there was an immense amount of international media coverage related to myself and my work here in Albuquerque, New Mexico in the United States, where I do my work and research. And I had a visit by Mr. Christopher Mellon, who was a high-ranking member within the Pentagon, and he had a vested interest in UFOs, UAPs, and of course has been instrumental with much of what has transpired on Capitol Hill with regard to the U.S. intelligence community taking UAPs or UFOs seriously. We had a wonderful discussion. Chris is extremely interested in triangular UFOs and my research. And while he was here, we had a very interesting discussion for a History Channel TV episode of Unidentified. And we had an entire episode devoted to triangular UFOs, which touched on my research. As a result of the media coverage, I had received hundreds of additional triangular UFO reports from witnesses worldwide. And many of these date back to the 1970s or earlier. But I think contemporaneous reports, in other words, reports that were filed in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, etc., are much more compelling than people claiming they saw a triangular UFO 30, 40, or 50 years ago. And then there was also a skeptical claim made in the episode, which I want to touch on because we're going to use that as a springboard for our investigation of the cases I'm going to show you. A UK UFO researcher was in that same program, and he was quoted as saying, from the 1970s onwards, you get this increasing trend of people to see giant triangular objects or wedge-shaped objects, and I think the easiest place to look for an answer is popular culture. He goes on to state, and the film I remember seeing from childhood, which had a huge triangular-shaped or wedge-shaped object, was the very first Star Wars film. When was that released? 1977. You get this huge Imperial Star Destroyer coming into view. Then he concludes by stating, strangely enough, this is the same period of time that people start seeing these huge, dark, triangular-shaped objects with pulsing lights moving silently across the countryside at night. Well, I take issue with that statement for a number of reasons. One, I don't look for the easiest place to look for an answer. I look for the most accurate place to look. And looking at the historic case files that we are now in possession of, that provides us with the best insights. And in fact, there's a rich history of triangular UFOs prior to the release of Star Wars in 1977. And the history of reports suggests not all triangles are military in origin. And I think this really touches on something that we deal with, that we wrestle with within the UFO field, UFO community, belief versus reality. I've always stated it doesn't matter what you believe regarding UFOs if the data doesn't support that belief. And that applies to myself as well as everyone listening to this program. And if the data is contradictory to that belief, then we certainly have to take a step back and reconsider our position on the UFO subject. What matters are the facts. And what does the research data reflect? And we're going to look at some of that in the course of our presentation. Well, in looking at my book and my previous research, I had 20 characteristics establishing a profile of these triangular UFOs. There were 10 that were primary characteristics and 10 that were secondary, lesser known or lesser repeated characteristics, but yet those that do seem to have prevalence in the UFO data. We don't have time to go into all of these, but suffice it to say, these are characteristics that I found in the data set leading up to 2012. I was amazed that when I obtained this new set of historical UFO case files, not only did I find over 100 triangular UFO reports from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, most, if not all of them, demonstrated multiple characteristics that I outlined in my book based on my previous data set. So it was the best outside validation for what I had written. And we're going to look at some of these historical cases, just a handful, unfortunately, given the small amount of time that we have to cover the material. But I want you to recognize that these reports were filed during a time when flying discs or flying saucers were highly prevalent. These were being reported by disparate witnesses across the United States as well as other countries, and these reports have never been seen before by the general public. Unless you would have gone to the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago over the last 30 or 40 years, you would not have access to these case files. So I'm happy to share these with you for the first time, especially on a venue like this where it's an international dialogue regarding the UFO subject. And we're going to review these very quickly chronologically, and again, meant to be a high-level review. I just briefly want to share with you the types of reports and sketches that we have on file regarding these historic cases. The first one, Carson Sink, Nevada, July of 1952, multiple triangular UFOs were observed by two pilots, two Air Force pilots. This is a Project Blue Book form, and the red markings you see on their handwriting is that of Dr. J. Allen Hynek's. And these two pilots described seeing arrowhead-shaped UFOs or aircraft. And it's interesting to note that Dr. Hynek at the top wrote Delta Wing Craft. And in fact, not only did they observe this, but they were debriefed by Air Force personnel after their sighting. And they were shown drawings of experimental aircraft of the time, but none of them could be applied to what these two Air Force officers observed. But we have to take a step back for a moment and realize that as we look at the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there were developments on the part of human technology as it relates to military aircraft. The Americans had the F-102 Delta Dagger. The Australians, under contract with the French government, had the Dassault Mirage 3. And in the UK, the Vulcan bomber was a very unusual aircraft that had been seen and probably sparked some UFO reports. And then in the Soviet Union, we had the MiG-21. All of these have a rough delta-shaped or delta wing configuration, but based on the flight characteristics and lighting configurations, most of what we're going to see today, if not all, I don't think can be attributed to any one of these types of aircraft. Now, Albany, Georgia, 1953, Project Blue Book record card, which I have on file here from Dr. Hynek's personal files. A pilot was flying a solo mission over Albany, Georgia at night and observed a circular light that was alternating white, orange. And then, as the report states, the object changed from a light to a deep red color and triangular in shape. And the object then split from one triangle into two triangles, one directly above the other, which then disappeared. This is one of the more unique cases that demonstrates shape-shifting, but also multiple triangular UFOs. And this was observed by an Air Force pilot. In addition, the Albany, Georgia airport had radar confirmation of this UFO sighting, one of a number of radar confirmations regarding triangular UFOs. Then in 1954, August, in the state of Florida, We had a couple that observed multiple triangular UFOs flying over their home. They made absolutely no sound, and the report was actually in the local newspaper. Another report of multiple triangular UFOs, Detroit, Michigan, 1957. These bright blue luminous objects were observed that had a white glow around them. And as you can see here, the witness stated there was no noise present. Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I'm reporting from currently, in 1958, summer of 1958, there was a low altitude flight, a silent flight of a triangular UFO. There was an array of lights in a triangular formation, not just 3 points, but literally lining the sides of this object. And they were described as orange or amber lights. When I saw this particular report, it made me think of another military report involving triangular UFOs. This was in Tucson, Arizona back in 1950. It was described as an equilateral triangle with white lights, estimated 10 to 20, that were evenly spaced along the perimeter of the object, which clearly delineated a triangular shape to this aircraft or UFO. And again, another triangular UFO report by an Air Force pilot. Then in Maine, late August of 1960, I found this report. It was a report of a girl and her parents that were awakened at night, and they noticed these lights moving around in the sky. They actually noticed 5 triangular UFOs, which you can see sketched here by crayon by the girl. And both her and her parents observed these 5 triangular UFOs moving in the sky. In addition, they not only saw it with the naked eye, they were able to use binoculars to train their eyesight on these objects to where they could clearly see what you see pictured here in crayon. Later in 1960, a case that I referenced in my book, I found the original news clipping in the NICAP case files. And I love to see headlines like this from 1960, flying triangle seen in state, and at the top, new saucer twist. They noticed that this was a change in what they were used to reporting at the time. All of the characteristics that you see written in red there were exemplified in this report. One of the most unusual characteristics involving this multiple witness sighting was the fact that there was no noise evident as they were observing this thing moving around, hovering, and rapidly accelerating. And this is what it looked like if we were to color it in based on the description. Then in Florida, we had a very unusual sighting. There was a hunter out with his dogs, and as he was out doing his hunting, he suddenly got this instinct to look directly up. And when he looked up, this is what he observed. It was a dull pink diamond-shaped object with a black line running through the middle. But as he observed it, within a matter of a second or two after first noticing it, the object began to divide into 2 triangles, and at which point the luminosity changed. It went from a dull pink to a bright red. And then, as he's observing this, the 2 triangles took position one next to the other, and then they slowly moved off and disappeared. And I found this to be interesting because I found other correlations with triangular and diamond-shaped UFOs or UAPs. This is a case that I found in a local news clipping from the UK from 1980, and the witnesses stated that they saw a diamond and triangular-shaped craft hovering over one of the roads. And so this is one of many cases that I have on file involving diamond-shaped and triangular UFOs being seen in proximity with one another. In 1964, we have this UFO report, again observed with binoculars, large size, slow speed, 3 bright lights at each point, and silent flight. And again, no sound whatsoever was emphasized by the witness. We have this crude triangular sketch. This was in Pleasantville, Pennsylvania in 1964. What's interesting to note is what I call blunt end forward movement, where the point of the triangle is not the leading edge, rather the flat side. And you can see that noted here, as you see highlighted in red, the arrow showing the direction of flight. And it was the broad edge forward movement as the witness described. And again, at the bottom of the report there you see no sound. Then I found a very intriguing triangular UFO report in the NICAP case files in the form of a news clipping. You can see the headline, Triangular Soundless Craft Seen. This was an individual who was working at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Washington State. And as he was getting off work, he looked up and saw this silent triangular object drifting overhead, and it was illuminated by the naval ship's lights that were shining on the underside or the underbelly of this triangle. And it slowly moved off. What I found to be interesting, though, is as I researched the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, 1965 was the first year that they started working and repairing nuclear-powered naval vessels. So is this yet one more example of UFOs or UAPs and nuclear weapons, nuclear military devices, nuclear storage sites? I found that to be an interesting correlation in this particular case. 1965 also, we had a young gentleman who was working at a golf course at night who described seeing this triangular UFO with an orange light at each tip that was steady, very reminiscent of the modern reports that we have. I also have, but I don't have time to play for you, a rare historic reel-to-reel recording from the 1960s of the witness. So with many of these cases, we not only have the written documentation, but also audio recordings, which I'm in the process of digitizing and digitally remastering. But in addition, we also have the police report form. The police were dispatched after the young gentleman had reported his UFO. In 1965, the same night as the Rochester, Minnesota sighting, in New Hampshire, we had this UFO reported to NICAP. And you can see there the sketch, and if we color that in based on the witness description, this is what the triangular UFO looked like. In 1965 in Texas, we had this very unusual triangular UFO reported, again, to National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomenon. If we color it in, the witness described red glowing panels on the underside. There are a number of fairly recent, within the last 20-30 years, UK triangular UFO reports that I have on file that describe a very similar type of illuminated panel design on these objects. In 1965, we have a rare report coming from the East, Japan, in this particular instance, in the province of Hokkaido. We had this young gentleman pictured in this rare news clipping, and you can see a sketch of the triangular or almost boomerang-shaped UFO that he saw flying overhead. Just 3 days after this particular sighting in Hokkaido, which you see on the right, across the Sea of Japan, in South Korea, near Taiwan, we had American U.S. Army personnel that observed two triangular UFOs moving across the face of the moon. And it was enough to where it warranted them filing this report, which ultimately wound up in the NICAP case files. And I found it to be intriguing because for those that have read my book, one of the earliest cases I have is from 1882, as reported in Scientific American, where astronomers in the United States observed two triangular UFOs in front of the moon, moving over the lunar surface. This is a screenshot from UFOs Declassified, which is a Smithsonian Channel sponsored production. And they did a wonderful job recreating this case from 1882, but I found it to be eerily similar in nature to the Taiwan, South Korea case. In Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, towards the end of 1965, we had this triangular UFO that was observed. The witness initially thought it was an aircraft until, as it was moving slowly, it suddenly stopped on a dime and slowly turned and then moved in a different direction. Just 3 days later, after the Oklahoma City sighting, we had this report filed to NICAP. This was in 1965 in the state of Pennsylvania, and here you can see the lighting configuration and description that the witness provided. In 1966, in Louisville, Kentucky, we had this triangular orange UFO, and this is an example of one of those with a colored or glowing underside, where you don't see specific lights, rather the entire object is bathed in this light. But here is a case from 1966. And later in 1966, in the state of New Hampshire, we have this one, which you can see in the NICAP report form. The witness stated it was definitely triangular in shape and just looked black. And then they also described red, green, and yellow lights at each point. In 1966, in the state of California, a very similar object was described with very similar lighting characteristics. This particular triangle was one of the smaller variations, estimated 25 feet in length and 20 feet wide. We have this case from 1967 in the state of Virginia, again reported to NICAP. Did the object have any sound? You see the witness states no. And what's intriguing about this particular case, the witness not only saw the triangle, but saw something eject from the triangle and then return back to it. And this is very reminiscent of the 1989 to 1991 Belgian UFO sightings, where they saw lights detaching and then going back to the parent object. But this is 1967, we have this report. 1967 also, in December of 1967, I stumbled across this report form. I came into the possession in 2005 of the UFO Study Group of Greater St. Louis's UFO collection, which included their case files. For those that don't know, the UFO Study Group of Greater St. Louis was actually the precursor for MUFON, which was then going to be the Midwest UFO Network, which eventually evolved into the Mutual UFO Network. This particular triangular UFO was reported, and I was very lucky in the sense that I lived in this same area where this had been reported decades before. I began to see if this witness might still be alive, as I do with many of these UFO reports. And in this particular case, I was able to track down the witness, and I would like to share an example of a witness in their own words describing their triangular UFO sighting, in this case, from December 1967.
Okay, it was after dark. It was late in the evening. I'm not sure now of the time. We were westbound on Highway 177 from Mascoutah to Belleville. We were right at the east edge of Belleville on 177, and we had right in that area when one of us noticed the object in the sky.
And then could you just describe the object when you noticed it, and then did it change appearance in any way, shape, or form, as you were obviously viewing it from different vantage points?
Yes. Always seemed to be in the shape of a slice of pie to me. Just that those dimensions had some thickness to it and an obvious triangular shape.
Okay. And you mentioned that there were some lights or windows, as you described?
There was a row of lights along one side. The side there was only one side visible at a time anyway.
And obviously you described it visually. What type of noise did you hear?
Absolutely silent. There wasn't a sound. There was no sound at all.
Hypothetically, if there was a skeptic sitting here right now and they said, you just simply misidentified as a conventional military aircraft, what would be your response to someone making that statement?
Well, I would, except for a few things, I would say, sure, could be. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I'd sure like to see what you're talking about that is, of that shape and is silent,
right.
That was the kicker for me.
And I do.
No noise.
And again, you kind of reiterate what you reported back in '68, because if you notice on the report form there, you said no sound.
None.
In response to the question, was there any noise?
Not a hum.
And you underlined it twice.
Yeah, no noise.
So in the literal sense of the term, you saw an unidentified flying object.
Absolutely, and still to this day unidentified as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to thank John Olak for his previous testimony. He was kind enough to not only let me interview him, but to share his name and to share segments of the interview with you. In 1968, a few months after his sighting, in the state of New York, we had this report in the NICAP case files. And you can see the headline, Report Seeing Flying Triangle Outlined by Lights. Very similar to other reports that we have on file. In this particular instance, you can see on the sketch shown below the vehicle, the car, driving on the road. And this triangle was moving towards the motorist, towards the witness, with the flat side as the leading edge, as we had demonstrated earlier with some of the other cases. What was interesting about this is it was moving up over some trees and then dropped down a hill and was actually down in a ravine. As the motorist was driving, he could look off to the side, but look down to see the triangular UFO. It was a much lower elevation than his position up on the road, which really affords a very unique or rare opportunity to see one of these triangles from above. Prior to seeing the triangle, about a mile or two down the road prior to seeing the triangle, he saw this red light that was moving around. Again, very reminiscent of the Belgian wave from 89 to 91. So we do start to see some of these patterns. But again, you see the fact that the object could hover. It was of immense size and was a very dramatic sighting, very detailed sighting compared to some of the other reports we have on file. And then in Hartford, Connecticut, in 1969, a year later, we had another motorist driving. Many of these are motorists, not just individuals standing near their home or standing outside their home. This particular motorist saw this object, which she sketched in a series of sketches, which always gives us a nice idea of how the sighting played out. But in this particular instance, like many of the motorists, the witness observed the UFO, pulled the vehicle over, turned the engine off, turned the radio down, and rolled the window down and listened. And there was absolutely no sound evident on this triangular UFO that was hovering very close to her car. And then in 1969, in Indianapolis, Indiana, we don't have a specific date, but it was in September of that year, we had a UFO witness that described this. I could see dimly lit from ground lights below a tremendous silvery shape in the form of what was most definitely clear, a huge, perfectly triangular shape. The lights definitely were affixed to the points of the triangle. Most unbelievably swift, it disappeared down to the western horizon, and most strangely, I did not even hear a suggestion of a sound at all, and I do have normal hearing, the witness went on to state. But this is what the witness included in the form of a sketch. When we look at this type of sketch, as some of the others that we've seen, this is very reminiscent of the modern day triangular UFO reports we receive. And if we color it in, based on the witness description, this is what it would have looked like. The lights steady, the shape clearly visible, ground lights reflecting off of it. And so in this particular case, we can see the direction of movement was the point as the leading edge. But again, complete absence of sound. 1970, we have a very unique case that took place. There were 4 individuals that had just left a local UFO meeting. And as they were driving home, they noticed a series of lights. And as the lights got closer, again, they were motorists driving in their vehicle. They pulled over and they saw this object moving with lights affixed. And you can see the sketch on the left. You can see one of the witness sketches where you have alternating red and green lights on the flat side of the triangle, one of the flat sides. And then we see another witness sketch here on the right. If we go to our next slide, we see that one of the witnesses was, in fact, Mr. Earl Neff, pictured there on the left. Mr. Earl Neff in the 1960s in the United States, specifically in the state of Ohio, was a highly respected and very prevalent UFO researcher of the time, and he was regarded as one of the more credible researchers of that time. He was one of the witnesses along with the 3 other witnesses in this vehicle. This is his personal sketch of the triangular UFO with the alternating red and green lights on the flat side, gray body to the triangle itself, and if you notice the arrow indicating direction of movement, this is another example with the flat side or blunt in forward movement that we see with many of the modern day accounts and as we've seen with some other historical accounts. And then in 1970 also we have Zilla Washington. This particular instance was yet another one where a witness looked up, saw an unusual light, and then got his binoculars, retrieved his binoculars, focused his eyesight on the object. This is what the object looked like when first seen. And then when he applied the binoculars, he was able to get greater detail. He could see an entire series of white lights or windows that were in horizontal lines across the body of this triangle. And if we color the triangle in, we can get an idea of what it looked like. This is what the witness observed through binoculars in 1970 in the state of Washington. Then in 1972, in the state of New York, we had this report filed to the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, or NICAP, and you can see the statement at the end there. The witness states it was like no object as had ever been seen before. And they described it as slow flight, large size, and very low altitude flight. And if you notice on the sketch, there was a beam of light radiating from the tip of this triangle, and this one was moving with the tip forward. Then in 1975, we have the first sustained flap of triangular UFO sightings. All of these other ones had been individual sightings, but for the first time ever in my historical research that I've uncovered in the United States, we had an entire week from April 3rd to April 9th, 1975 in the state of North Carolina, in and around Lumberton, North Carolina, the sighting of triangular UFOs. The vast majority of witnesses during this entire week were police officers who were patrolling at night. And an interesting side story to this particular instance, the gentleman who you see pictured at the center on the top, Mr. Lee Spiegel, is a researcher in the field of UFOs for many years. He has his own podcast, and he's lectured at various conferences in the United States. He's a personal friend and colleague of mine as well. He was requested in 1975 by Dr. J. Allen Hynek. He received a call from Dr. Hynek, who asked if Lee could go down and try to find out what these police officers and other witnesses are observing. And Lee went down, and the first night immediately went to the Lumberton, North Carolina Police Department. The officers took him out to a field where just the night before they had observed a triangular UFO. And as they were standing at the edge of this field where there was this big opening, this clearing, they said, well, the light last night appeared over those trees and it slowly moved overhead, and then we realized it was this triangular object. As they're standing there describing this, suddenly they see a light appear in the same spot in the sky as it had appeared the night before. The light slowly moved towards them silently, and the object came overhead, and it was not just a light, but a triangular object that this light was affixed to. This artist's rendition by Dale Hendrickson depicts what transpired. As the triangle came overhead, Lee, who you see pictured in the center there, was very close to getting hit by this beam of light, and he was surrounded by all these other police officers who were witness to this particular instance. These officers who you see pictured here were just a handful of officers in Lumberton and in the county around them that had observed triangular UFOs. I have the original CUFOS case file, including Lee's personal notes and interviews with the witnesses. Of note, I found this particular write-up. There was a police officer sitting in his squad car at night. The UFO came 200 feet above his car, which demonstrates low altitude flight. He got out and the object started slowly moving away. So as it did, it shone a spotlight down on him. So here's another example of beams of light being emitted. And then the officer got in his squad car, started following it. As I have highlighted there, the police officer was able to clock it with his speed gun, with his radar gun. And he was able to get a return on his radar gun, and the UFO was moving at 200 miles per hour. So yet one more example of radar, this time not military radar or FAA radar, but a radar gun from a police officer that clocked a triangular UFO moving at 200 miles per hour. In the wake of the Lumberton, North Carolina sightings, in the case files that I have here and in the personal notes of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, he had written a letter in December of 1975. As I was reviewing the case file, I stumbled across this statement that Dr. Hynek made. He states, "We feel that those reported sightings have some validity as genuine unexplained phenomena because of a combination of factors, V-shaped or delta-shaped objects being reported independently by 23 observers." But then he goes on to state the characteristics, which were almost prophetic, given the fact that I had outlined the same characteristics with triangular UFO reports that I had been looking into. Absence of sound, absence of noise, ability of object to hover for extended periods at low altitudes, and ability of object to execute flat as opposed to bank turns, objects seen at treetop level and descending below treetop level several times, and the object lighting configuration not compatible with conventional aircraft lights. Well, that was a very significant sighting, a wave of sightings, flap of sightings involving triangular UFOs. And there were many, many others after that across the United States. But fast forward 2 years, 1977, Memphis, Tennessee, a very similar situation played out, not over a period of a week, but over the course of one early morning, starting in the early morning hours of May 17th. This headline from the Memphis Press Scimitar really says it all. 5 law officers report UFO over Shelby. In point of fact, there were more than 5 law officers. There were multiple tactical squads in and around Memphis, Tennessee that observed the triangular UFO. And like many of these other police sightings and the January 5th, 2000 Southern Illinois case that I investigated, a very similar situation where officers observed a triangular UFO. These officers were in radio contact where they were able to compare notes and describe it. In fact, the first reporting group didn't mention it was triangular. So when the dispatcher came on later and said, these other officers on the other side of town are describing it, they said it's triangular. And at that point, one of the initial officers stated, at that point, we knew they saw what we did because we didn't say anything over the radio that it was triangular in shape. So again, we have this corroboration by multiple witnesses and in this particular instance, police officers. And a side note, the movie Star Wars was not officially released until 8 days after this Memphis, Tennessee sighting. So going back to the UK researcher's statement that Star Wars was a cultural influence for all triangular UFO reports, all I have to say is so much for cultural influences. Admittedly, there are cultural influences that can shape certain UFO reports, but I don't think we can use it as a blanket explanation for all UFO reports, and certainly with the Memphis, Tennessee case, as well as these historical cases, which I shared with you, which is, again, just a small handful of ones that I do have on file, going through the NICAP and CUFOS case files and Blue Book case files. There's a rich history of these triangular UFOs. And my conclusions, the triangles are nothing new. We've been dealing with these triangular UFOs for many, many decades worldwide. In my book, I even touch on a significant wave of sightings involving triangles over Denmark, starting in the fall of '57 into the spring of 1958. The triangles have been ever present in the UFO data. These are not people stating, I saw this 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. These are contemporaneous reports documented at the time when, again, triangular UFOs were not in style. Most people were describing balls of light, spheres, or flying saucers, not triangular UFOs. And the reports are consistent in their detailed narratives. The 10 primary and 10 secondary characteristics that I outline in my book and in my previous research, looking at the data sets that I had at the time, are playing out again in this huge new subset of data that I have as a result of these historic case files. And the singular military explanation for the entire history of these reports lends to a revisionist history of aviation and aerospace technology development that I think borders on the delusional. Many people speculate that we've had this technology for decades, and many of these UFOs, if not all these UFOs, are really top secret military technology. Why are we investing billions and trillions of dollars in inferior jet propulsion technology with naval fighters, Air Force fighters, etc., if we have such advanced technology? And if our adversaries have this technology, why haven't they used it against us in an adversarial or aggressive way? And then when we look at the common characteristics, they continue to exist with new data sets that we examine. In this particular case today, looking at the NICAP and the CUFOS case files, but we could argue that many of these other case files that are out there also demonstrate very similar things. In fact, just within the last month, I have acquired the Antonio Huneeus UFO library and case file collection. And in going through those, I have already stumbled across a handful of triangular UFO reports. Most of these are not in the United States. They're in South American countries as well as some European countries. And so as I acquire new data sets, I will be looking at these case files and trying to see if, in fact, the patterns that I've laid out in my book are exemplified in these new data sets. I will also be having another collection arriving later this month by a researcher who investigated the 1897 airship sighting reports. It'll be an entire 4-drawer file cabinet of news clippings of 1897 airship sightings. I don't know if I'll find any triangular UFO reports there, but the point is that there are these data sets that exist out there. And I think it's incumbent upon myself and others who have this historical data to make it available, to share it with other researchers. Collectively, I think we can work together to try to find at least maybe some insights. I'm not arrogant enough to think we're going to find definitive answers, but insights into this UFO phenomenon, doing the work that we're doing by looking at these historical cases. Many people state that, well, we need to investigate current cases. I agree that that's important, but I feel that collectively as a UFO community, we do a great job of trying to go out and collect current UFO case reports. But what's the point of getting yet one more UFO report to throw onto a pile of other case files if we're not taking the time to look at patterns or potential patterns in that data? And so I'm very happy to be collecting this historical information. I have a vast archive here in Albuquerque, which I make available to researchers. And myself, Barry Greenwood, Jan Aldridge, Rod Dyke, many of the United States archivists and historians are sharing data, and we're also systematically trying to scan and digitize this information, not only in the form of the case files, the paper files and news clippings, but also, as I alluded to earlier, looking at these old 1950s, 1960s reel-to-reel recordings and cassette recordings. I have, over the last 2 years, digitized approximately 260 reel-to-reel recordings, and I just received about another 300 cassette recordings of interviews with witnesses, interviews with researchers, and all of that information, in my opinion, are data sets. The more data sets that we have, the more information we acquire, the more information that we share with one another in this UFO community, I think the better we will be for it. Because I feel that we have no shortage of UFO information, but we have to take the time to systematically gather that information, look for patterns in the data, and most importantly, share it with fellow researchers. And I'm especially happy to be able to share a little glimmer of the research that I've been conducting. And again, there's a lot more to it. I could probably talk for 2 to 3 hours, but I promised that I would stay within a certain time constraint. But there is a lot of work being done, not only by myself, but many other researchers and historians looking at the data available. And again, as I alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, when you look at the dialogue, you look at the news coverage, you look at the intelligence community in the United States talking about investigating UFOs or UAPs, NASA now coming on board to start looking at UFOs or UAPs, I find that they are restricting the dialogue to 2004 to 2022 and moving forward. And I feel that we need to represent the phenomenon, we need to represent the history, we need to provide the documentation that we have to support the fact that the UFO UAP phenomenon did not begin in 2004. And we need to paint an accurate history of this phenomenon to educate those that are coming into this for the first time, due to the fact that there is this erosion of skepticism, this erosion of ridicule that myself and others have had to deal with for decades. So we're entering a new era within the UFO or UAP, to use the new nomenclature, phenomenon. And I'm happy to be able to see it, but I feel that we also need to step up to the plate, provide the information that we have, represent this subject matter in a professional manner. And it's venues like this, the 5th Symposium on Ufology and Exobiology, that allows us to be able to do that. And it's just one small way of addressing this UFO subject. And admittedly, the history is just one small aspect. We have official agencies and documentation regarding the subject. We have various groups that are looking at UAP detection systems, real-time detection and recording on various scientific instrumentation of UFOs, UAPs as they occur. Very exciting times with our technology, but also field investigation by MUFON and other individuals and collectives that are trying to gather UFO data as new cases occur. I don't think that we can rely on the government or any officials to give us the full story, but I feel that, again, the UFO community needs to come together now more than ever to investigate the subject, to educate the public, because I don't think we're going to get all the answers from official agencies. But we have the data, we have platforms like this, and I'm just so happy to be part of this subject matter, and I'm happy to share some of my findings with you today. And with that, I'd like to thank you. For people that are interested in my work, my research, my archive, please go to my website, www.davidmarlerufo.com. And I want to thank the people that put this event together. Again, we can do our research, but if we don't have a platform to present this information, it's really for naught. It's just for our own personal interest and curiosity. So I want to wish everyone well. It's wonderful to be part of an international gathering of researchers to discuss the UFO UAP subject, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I hope you enjoy my colleagues as they present their information. Thank you.